listening to Centered. This week, big, beautiful tax cuts for the rich and cuts to Medicaid. The CBS News chief is ousted under pressure from the Trump administration's lawsuit. And habeas corpus, or veni vidi vici, the DHS secretary flails on unlawful detention. Our panel, former White House and DHS spokesman Louis Miranda, former Clinton appointee and former senior Republican on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Carl Meacham, and former CBS executive, author, and publicist Jeremy Murphy. I'm Louis Miranda. Thank you for tuning in. First, Nooorm! George Wendt, the actor best known for portraying Nooorm on the 1980s hit sitcom Cheers, died this week at the age of 76. His film and TV credits were extensive, but the everyman that he portrayed on Cheers captured the affection of arguably the last generation to have a shared experience on television. The series finale had an audience of more than 80 million. Jeremy, talk to us about what he represented.
Well, I think you said it right. He was everyman. You know, it was a place where everybody knows your name. And it was, the beauty of the show was the simplicity. You know, people coming to a bar and becoming family. And, you know, it really tapped into something because the show came on, in the early 80s, and we were still in kind of a depression, with gas prices and, the Reagan economic, the go-go 80s really hadn't happened yet. So a lot of people were suffering. And, he was a guy who, hated the monotony of his life. So he came to a bar and he saw these people. And it tapped into something. And it was like cozy slippers. It was something that you watched every week. It was funny. It was warm. People liked each other. The writing was good. And it really tapped into something.
And I think that what you said about people liking each other, even when they disliked each other.
Yeah.
I think some of the character dynamics on that show, whether it was between Nooorm and Carla, were particularly biting. And yet they were kind of a family, right? It's the way you sit around the family gathering, yep. And there's going to be tensions, but you like each other.
It was where everybody knew your name. And I think that was really good. And it was just like a fun show. It wasn't vicious. The writing wasn't vicious. It wasn't like ironic to be ironic. It was good humor, and the characters were likable, and they liked each other, and that came across.
And there's a little bit of nostalgia too, because we lost a little bit of that connection that you had with people in person. Mm-hmm. Now that everyone's just on their phones. I don't think that happens enough anymore. So it's sort of the last bit of Americana before you end up on your mobile devices.
I mean, it would be if it would today, it would be where everybody knows your handle.
Yeah, I just remember, being a kid, and I think it was Thursday night, and you had the Cosby Show on, you had a Night Court, I think Hill Street Blues, that was the lineup, and this was sort of, I think that the humor in it might have been a little, it was grown-up humor at the time, I remember, but what you could feel easily was that it was a symbol of community. Everybody around the bar and everybody knew each other, this familiarity that I think maybe we miss a lot here in the U.S. now, a slower, funnier, maybe more connected America where being ordinary, being regular would still be okay.
I agree. I think we do miss that because a lot of the humor that's on TV right now is vicious, and it's clever to be clever. You know what I mean? It's not collegial. It's not warm. It's not togetherness. It's everybody sniping at each other or trying to make, witty insults. And this was just fun. These characters liked each other. And, they had like their foibles and they teased each other, but lovingly.
But yeah, he gave us a lot of laughs. It was a great show. And again, I think it speaks to the need to connect with people even when they're different. And look, that whole show was also about redemption. This was about a baseball player who had been a big star and sort of lost it all, but took what he had left and opened up a bar.
Yep.
And turned it into a family. And I think maybe we can take a little bit of inspiration in that from George Wendt's passing and remember that there is a road back for all of us.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk Trump's big, beautiful bill. House Republicans passed a bill that would extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts for billionaires, fulfill a campaign promise on eliminating taxes on tips, more spending on border security, but significant cuts to health care. Democrats seem to have finally gotten their footing in terms of challenging this bill. But of course, it was always a given that they could get it out of the House. What can we expect on the Senate?
Yeah, it was definitely Trump's show. He went up to the Hill this week and really cajoled and pushed the members that were sort of on the fence. But I do think that Democrats found their footing a little bit better here. This bill passed the House 215 to 214, about one vote. The bill jams together permanent tax cuts for the rich, about $300 billion in border and defense boosts, deep Medicaid cuts, and about $4 trillion in a debt ceiling hike. And they did this in a way that under reconciliation rules that you're able to dodge the filibuster. And so this is a massive win for Speaker Johnson, who was able to get the Republican caucus to meet his Memorial Day deadline, and it's a big victory for Trump. He reminded everybody that he was still the boss, and everybody, basically genuflected and kissed his ring. But the turn here was that Democrats showed up, right? And more importantly, they showed unity. They framed the bill as a tax scam, a handout to billionaires, right? An assault on the working poor. And I think it's a political time bomb, so to speak, for 2026. And they forced this 20-hour floor showdown. And their messaging was really crisp and united, I would say. Now the bill, as you mentioned, Luis, is moving to the Senate, where moderates are going to have to deal with the Medicaid cuts.
But Carl, I would argue with that part, because it wasn't that united when you consider that there's plenty of Republicans who were very much upset about the fact that this is going to blow up the budget. I mean, essentially, this is a big spending bill that is reckless. You have a lot of investors looking at the United States now as a place that is, unclear how stable it's going to continue to be, but also that it's reckless in its own spending and may not be the best place for their investments. That's been the general analysis, and plenty of Republicans who are the balanced budget Republicans are really balking at what they've seen. So I'm not sure that they've been all that united. And there's been plenty of Republicans who are upset about the idea of cutting healthcare, because the Medicaid cuts are going to be felt by their constituents.
Yeah, we'll see what that comes out to be in the Senate, right? In the House, it was very united. And I would say that that first step that they took was a sort of a very clear sort of representation of their loyalty for the president. And it's very clear that the president's visit did make a difference with a lot of the folks that were holding out in the House. But as you're saying, the Senate will be a different environment, and there will be changes to the bill in the Senate. The question that I still have, though, is if this unity that Democrats have shown, if this can become a more effective unity. I think for Democrats, it's an opportunity to really show something to a group of Americans, an American constituency out there that really wants action and doesn't want any more rhetoric, and wants people to push back hard on Trump's attempt to pass his presidency in one giant legislative package. The question here is if the Democrats are going to be as pragmatic as they can be to deal with some of the necessary cuts that have to happen, and really also hold to things like Medicaid, like you've mentioned, things like on the immigration side. Are they going to be pragmatic on the security side? So they're defining themselves in a way that the American public can see as an alternative to Trump. This is something that I think is an opportunity for Democrats, but we're yet to see if that unity on message that we saw in the House can translate to unity on action in the Senate.
I'm fascinated. Like everybody who studies economics, banking, finance, whatever, is saying that this is this is so wrong. Like, these people have no idea what they're doing. The bond market's crashing. Our credit rating is down. Don't you have to know what you're doing? Like, they're dealing with trillions of dollars. I don't even think these people can do math. I mean, it is so stupid, and it just baffles me. Like, why aren't they listening to the people who run the economy and, measure debt? They're not even listening to people?
I think they would say that they're listening to their constituents. And a couple of episodes ago, right, Jeremy, you were making points about what resonates with the American public, what they're watching and what they're not. The American public are just going to see, that they saved money. The American public are just going to see that, they strengthened the border.
I think they're going to see something else, though. They're going to see 8.6 million Americans lose health insurance in the coming years. They're going to see more than 3 million Americans who receive food assistance lose that as well. I think that could be offset by the tips tax cut, which I know a lot of folks in the service industry are excited about. But the reality is that people are going to feel a very significant increase in their costs at the lower levels of the income brackets. It's really the most well-off who are going to benefit from this package. And I don't think that's going to be good for Republicans, but it does present the opportunity for Democrats to show that contrast, to say, look, we were the ones who fought to reduce the number of people who didn't have access to health insurance. And by the way, what a bonehead move to make on the healthcare side in terms of what it costs American taxpayers, because the reason we wanted more people to have health insurance is because when they don't have health insurance, when you kick people off of Medicaid, for example, they're only going to go get healthcare when they need to go to an emergency room. And healthcare costs are going to skyrocket, and the whole community ends up paying for that. So it gets much, much more expensive for people to wait to get treatment, to not get their annual checkups, to just go to the emergency room. That ends up being much, much more expensive and costly. And so it's very short-sighted. They're trying to couch it as they're just fixing and tightening works requirements for people who arguably should be able to work instead of, as they keep saying, staying home and playing video games. But the reality is that it affects people who arguably cannot afford good health care, who should have health care, and who now, when they do get sick, are going to cost taxpayers much more money. So it's bad on the budget front. It's bad for health. It's bad for people who are not billionaires.
Washington is the one place where not knowing what you're doing is an asset. These people are like, I'm not from Washington. I'm not from the swamp. I've never done this before. Well, do you say that to the doctor? Do you say that to a lawyer? I want a lawyer who's never done this before. These people are, it's insane that they have no idea what they're doing, and they keep doing it.
And it just reflects that people are fed up. And even with the logic that Luis mentioned, right? A lot of people are distrustful of that logic. So generally, folks end up doing or voting when it affects them. And if we make, they're not going to vote on projections. They vote on exact action that hits them and that they're suffering from. So these things that you're saying, Luis, if they come to be, then you will see a reaction from the voter. But I don't think that they trust the views of Democrats. And I think that they're skeptical of Republicans, but I do believe that they're giving them a chance, and we're yet to see what the result of these policies are going to be. I do think, though, that Democrats were way more aligned on how they were discussing on the messaging for this bill. I think that's a good thing. But again, seeing is believing. I want to see what the actions are going to be in the Senate to the items that they're opposed to, and then what are they going to go along with? These are big questions that are still out there.
Well, they won the election. We talked about this on our first episode. They won the election by saying that Democrats are for they, them, Donald Trump is for you. And yeah. I think what this clearly shows is that Donald Trump and the Republicans in Congress are for the billionaires, and Democrats are for hardworking people who need health care, who need economic opportunity. Democrats should be able to make this case. It's basics. It's fundamental. Keep it simple, stupid. There's just nothing here but a golden opportunity to really showcase that Republicans were never about the average American.
Yeah, the key point there is should. You know, they should be able to make the point, but we've watched how, there have been a series of issues during these last 3 months, right, where Democrats should have been able to make a clear case on rule of law and due process. They should have been able to make a clear case on issues having to do with freedom of the press, which I think we're going to discuss later, and they haven't. So, again, seeing is believing. I hope they can become a more a stronger force to hold accountable the administration. I still haven't seen that yet, but I do think that you have a nascent effort, and last night is evidence of that.
Yeah, indeed. We'll see what happens. I think there's plenty of time before the midterm elections, so there should be plenty of time for people to see the impacts and the results. Time will tell. Now, last week we talked about how the Trump administration is weaponizing the FCC to pressure media companies. This week, CBS News chief Wendy McMahon stepped down under pressure and as she stood up for the independence of the newsroom. Jeremy, this is the second high-profile resignation at CBS. What can we expect next?
I think you're going to see a lot of fallout. I mean, this is really not about the First Amendment. This is about Trump a cash grab. Trump sees a way to get money. So what's happening is, he filed some fake lawsuit about the way 60 Minutes was edited. Kamala's answer, which is stupid because CBS actually aired both versions. So it's not like they covered one version up. Trump sued them for billions of dollars, and he's using their sale as extortion. Basically, CBS is owned by Paramount, and they're selling to some other company, and it's being held up by the FCC over this bogus lawsuit. It's really a cash grab. This is a way for Trump to get money. I don't think he cares one way or another of how it was edited about the First Amendment. He just sees a way to get money.
Do the people at CBS not see the damage that they're creating by sort of kowtowing to it?
The people in the news division do, but they are infinitesimal to the overall money at stake. The merger's worth $8 billion, right? And it's being held up. The news organization is the face of a company, but it's like a fraction of what it brings in money-wise. It's a headache, and the people who want this transaction to go through are annoyed by it, and they're just going to pay him off. But the problem is, if they do that, they've really sacrificed the integrity of their news division, which did nothing wrong. I mean, this is so stupid. They edited an answer for clarity, which happens every day. I mean, that's why if you read a newspaper, you read an article, there's no ums, in people's quotes. That's kind of what they did in the interview. So it's sad that this is really tarnishing CBS. And I mean, the president stepped down, but I mean, that's the worst job in America. I mean, it keeps getting worse, and it's not going to get better.
The precedent is really bad. I mean, what this could do, making other news channels start self-censoring, and maybe they're already doing that, Jeremy. But this is like, I mean, I hear what you're saying about the money side of it, but as far as the First Amendment is a victim in the wake of this discussion.
Well, the owners of these news organizations don't respect that news is a trust. They don't respect that, and it has to have integrity. It's just a part of their portfolio. If you look at ABC is Disney and NBC is Comcast and all the great institutions, their owners used to give them great independence, and they stood up for them. Murrow, when he was fighting against McCarthy, Bill Paley owned CBS and backed him. And because they wanted everybody in Congress or in Washington wanted Murrow to go away, and Bill Paley backed him. Well, you don't have a Bill Paley anymore. No one's doing that. Wendy saw where the wind was blowing. Like, she couldn't win this one.
You have media already struggling just under the weight of people just tuning out. We talked about at the beginning of the show about George Wendt and Cheers. Cheers had more than 80 million viewers for its last episode. If you compare that to Friends, just a decade later, Friends kind of picked up right where Cheers left off in terms of that Thursday night powerhouse that NBC used to have on.
Yeah.
And yet Friends, by the time they had their season finale, they were at about 52 million. So that tells you the shift that had already begun back then, which has only been exacerbated by online services and people tuning into YouTube and looking for news in places other than major news outlets. And so you end up with a situation where they're already facing tremendous strains, budget cuts. We've seen local media basically disappear. Local newspapers don't have anywhere near the distribution that they used to have, and people just sort of listening to short clips on social media. And that's really scary in terms of what it means for having just a common sense or understanding of who we are and what facts are. That's I think what's most dangerous about this is that we're already getting to a place where no one can agree what the facts are. And to see CBS cave to the Trump administration this way only makes that worse.
Yeah, but the question is who's next? I mean, this is going to continue. This is a trend that's going to continue in the 24-hour news cycle, right? They're always trying to fill the news in to get clicks, to get people to watch. But my question, I guess, is like with what's happening at CBS, this is sending a very clear message that the president is sending on what he likes and what he doesn't like in the media. And the media is doing what he's saying. They're not pushing back.
But I also think that, the media is part of it. It's like they're part of big conglomerates now, where, the people at NBC also own theme parks, and GE owned NBC and they made microwaves. Media it's just a small part of their portfolios now. Yeah. Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post is like, less than 1% of what he's doing. So these companies need government for other stuff.
And, we talked last couple of weeks too also about the importance of comedy and breaking through the clutter and establishing those shared experiences that we're losing out on because of the diversification of media. One of the great ones that's doing it is The Daily Show. Their entire cast has been phenomenal. Ronnie Cheng, particularly this week. And let's watch a little bit of that.
Kristi Noem fails a pop quiz. Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security and one-woman kill shelter. Kristi Noem was testifying in Congress today about whether her administration is deporting people without habeas corpus, which is their right to due process. If you didn't know what habeas corpus was, don't worry. Kristi Noem didn't Google it either. Look, if Kristi Noem was just a random person on the street, I get it if she was like, habeas corpus? That's a Harry Potter spell, right?
Well, maybe the A1 lady can talk to her. Linda McMahon, she didn't know what AI was. She called it A1, and she's head in the education department.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't make this up. This writes itself.
Yep.
It's laughable if it wasn't so dangerous.
Serious. Yeah.
I want to say, for media, it's depressing, but I do think there's a model here. I mean, if you look at what the New York Times did, it's brilliant. They made themselves a newspaper or a content company. And, they used to own all these TV stations. They got rid of the TV stations because that's where they can get you, because the FCC regulates that. It's over-the-air signal, and that's how they can get you. The New York Times really shifted, and they're no longer dependent on advertising. It's strictly, they have 12 million people who are buying their content. And that's the model. Just go be very simple. If you're going to do news, be a news company. And they're really there's not much the Trump administration can do with them. They're not trying to buy microwave oven companies or other, they don't need the FTC. I don't think they can get at them much. I think they're pretty resistant. And I think that's the model.
Yeah, Wordle and the crossword and connections doesn't hurt.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we're looking at what Kristi Noem said, this is a really big deal. To be fair, Stephen Miller had already previewed this idea that they were not going to respect habeas corpus. Habeas corpus, of course, is the constitutionally enshrined principle that you can't have unlawful detention. that the government can't just willy-nilly lock people up. That is what's at stake in what we're talking about with a Homeland Security Secretary. When she claims she doesn't know that, that's kind of basic for that job. But Stephen Miller had already telegraphed that the White House was actively looking at suspending this constitutional principle. And to be fair to Stephen Miller, the Constitution does state that in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require the suspension of habeas corpus. But this really takes us back to why the president tried to invoke the Alien Enemies Act with regards to Venezuelans and why they continue to talk about irregular migration as an invasion. So far, the courts have not been with them. The courts have insisted that even under the Alien Enemies Act, the administration would have to give people due process. I think it makes it harder for them. But when you consider that the entire point of why people are coming is really economic, the invasion argument just doesn't hold. And I think at some point there has to be a reality check on that people are not coming here as an invasion. There may very well be threats. And I think this is where we have to call BS on both sides, because when the left tries to tell us that there are not threats coming at the southern border, that isn't true. Some may well be threats. And it is important that we have a robust security environment in place to detect those when they do come. But largely people are coming here because of economic reasons. And so the challenge that I think we're seeing is that the Republicans are trying to make it all out to be an invasion, all a national security issue. Democrats don't know what to say because they're scared of the issue now because they lost on it in 2024. And in the meantime, states are suffering because the workforce that they were depending on is in fear. Communities are being scared and tormented with scenes that play out on social media day in and day out of ICE raids or other federal agencies raiding people. I've been hearing stories from folks who've told me that they've seen ICE waiting in the back of churches, and it's creating a more negative image of ICE than I think is necessary. ICE has a legitimate role. So I think what's happening is going way beyond the pale.
Yeah, but remember, I mean, the president won on these issues. And even though the perspective that you're, raising is one of sort of a lack of empathy, I think that there's a lot of folks in the country that just want the problem to be dealt with, right? So getting ICE to go to places of worship, getting ICE to go to places of employment, for the folks that are passionately interested in dealing with the illegal immigration discussion, they would support that. But the issue that I want to just highlight is that, and we talked a little bit about this before, is that, Nooorm told the Senate that she believes that habeas corpus gives the power to the president to deport. And that's just flatly wrong. And there's some real danger here, too, that the administration is trying to suspend due process for immigrants by invoking the Alien Enemies Act, which I think you alluded to, Luis, saying that we're under an invasion by migrants from Venezuela. And the courts aren't buying this. And this is an area, I think, where there is pushback. They've blocked deportations, and yet one flight, I guess, reportedly left to South Sudan in violation of a court order. That's just not just policy overreach. That's potentially unconstitutional. Historically, only Congress has been able to suspend habeas corpus, and only in times of war or rebellion. But Trump's team, and you talked a little bit about Stephen Miller, is testing whether media spin and executive muscle can override that. I think they're trying to figure out if the American public would override that. And if they succeed, what stops them from targeting anyone else next time? So we're not just talking about immigration policy anymore. We're talking about the erosion of fundamental rights. We're talking about sidelining the sort of basic principles of what makes America America, and the presidency that sees the Constitution as optional.
Well, and let's remember, in Legally Blonde, Reese Witherspoon used habeas corpus to get her dog back. So,
oh boy, but let's take a step back, because on asylum, and this is a really important point.
Sure.
Asylum is basically what has been exploited at the southern border, and even at the northern one, where once you step foot on U.S. soil, by law you're allowed to claim asylum, and the laws are much too lenient, or have been traditionally. The regulations around the standards that you look at for that have been much too open, essentially allowing a wide, sort of a funnel top of people to go into the process initially, even if at the end the case is likely to result in them not getting asylum. So, when we were in the White House, or when we were in government, the White House had published that only about 20% of asylum cases actually get approved in the end. And that's after years of having someone in the process. And that sort of tells you that a lot of the people are coming for mostly economic reasons. Asylum is not for economic reasons. Asylum is something that exists for people who are being persecuted under very specific categories. And if your only reason for seeking asylum is economic, or even because you're fleeing generalized violence, that doesn't count for asylum, which is why those approval rates are so low. And what has been happening over the last decade and a half is people stating and claiming asylum because at a minimum it buys them years in the system waiting for that final decision. So there does need to be a fix to the asylum process. I think what the Trump administration is proposing and was part of the manager's amendment in this House bill is that people seeking asylum have to pay $1,000. Yes, that'll reduce the number of people who are seeking asylum, but it also weighs asylum strictly to people of significant resources, which I think is also the opposite of what asylum is intended to do. If you're fleeing direct persecution, you may well not have access to that. But it does acknowledge that there is a problem in people taking advantage of asylum, paying thousands of dollars to cartels to be brought to our borders to claim asylum, even when they don't actually qualify for it. So we have a problem on the one hand of media and the left largely treating anyone who shows up at the border as an asylum seeker. And you have a problem on the right of treating everyone as an invader or national security threat. And neither one of those things is true. The reality is we have an economic need for their labor, and they come here to work.
But don't forget, the assumptions matter, right? And the assumptions that you're outlining are clear, and logic is very clear with what you're saying, Luis. But the logic that I think the administration is operating under is they came in without permission. Therefore, they are illegal. They are not authorized to be here. And that's
also a lie with what they're revoking right now.
Right.
TPS, temporary protected status, is that people who were in the country from certain nationalities were given protection because of the conditions in their homeland that made it a bad situation for them to return, whether that's Venezuela or Haiti or other countries where TPS has been granted previously. You also have a lot of people who came in during the Biden years who came in legally. They waited in their countries or whatever country they were in, and they requested an advanced parole process, which meant that they went through an extensive screening and vetting before they got an approval to fly themselves here. Those people were here legally, and they're being treated as if they crossed the southern border illegally. And so there's a significant number of people who are getting caught up in this, who came legally, who had work permits, who were not breaking any laws, who are now potentially being picked up by ICE, who did not do anything other than follow processes that existed.
Well, I think we really need to keep our hearts and our minds for the real victims, the white South Africans who are being so we gotta look out for them. They're
By the way, that spectacle in the Oval Office was really something.
No, but on that point though, Jeremy, I mean, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because what the administration keeps on talking about is that these folks are, they can assimilate easier. They are consistent with the American ethos, right? They're just farmers. They're just farmers wanting to work the land. And they do highlight that there have been, and in all honesty, there have been some persecutions in South Africa from extreme folks, and there have been some deaths. But what we saw in the Oval Office with the president of South Africa being ambushed, and the implications that this has, not just for immigration law, Luis, and asylum law, which you know better than anyone on this panel, but that also speaks to, I would say, domestic constituents. And I would use a term that is maybe new for a lot of folks, but white minority politics. What he speaks about in South Africa and the rights of a minority of whites being persecuted, right, goes to a lot of insecurities and views that a lot of people in the United States have. And this is an area where he can talk about what's happening, where he can talk to Americans that feel similar issues by using the South African example. He can talk about white fear and white grievance by using the example of whites being persecuted in South Africa. So when we look at this issue, particularly the one that you mentioned, Jeremy, which I think we can laugh at it and compare to, a whole bunch of folks that deserve to be in that line of coming into the United States for humanitarian concerns and persecution. There's a logic and rationale that this administration is using, and it shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah, it can be very effective because it's exactly what fueled the MAGA movement. It's exactly what fuels a lot of the outrage that we see on Fox News, is this idea that a more diverse America is a threat to white Americans. That is largely where Donald Trump derived a lot of his strength, is that he was willing to talk about that when a lot of other politicians were not. And it helped his rise. And so it's you're absolutely right. We can look at it as a spectacle at the Oval Office, but it is resonating with a lot of people, and we have to be cognizant of that. We also have to be cognizant that asylum is a system that is no longer functioning the way that it's supposed to, because again, people abuse it. The border wall, even in a lot of places, is as much as a mile north of the border, which means that you can be an entire mile inside the United States before you even get to that wall and already have a right to claim asylum. And people take advantage of that. And that's what Congress has failed to step up to deal with, is how do we build a mechanism that's actually feeding the labor system that needs the workforce, and at the same time that deals with the interest from people from all over the world who want to come and work, and do it in a safe, orderly, and legal way. And that's what's missing from the conversation. I think that the Biden administration had actually done a good job of leveraging that. When people talk about remain in Mexico under Trump, only 20,000 people were subjected to remain in Mexico, while there were 1.4 million arrests at the southern border, or detentions at the southern border. 20,000 people. When you look at the systems that Biden put in place between CBP-1 and the Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Venezuelan parole process and all of that, you had millions of people who stayed where they were and waited. Many never made it to the border, and many were turned down before they ever came because they were told no. And that is at least a functioning system where people could be screened and vetted in advance, get a work permit when they came here, be able to fend for themselves because they had a work permit, as opposed to being a drain on local communities. That was a significant improvement, but it was a regulatory fix to what is really a problem with Congress not properly establishing a system for foreign labor to come in that meets the actual economic need that we have.
But let me ask you a question, Luis. Public sentiment on this issue has shifted. And I think there's more tolerance for removal of people that are in the United States unauthorized. We saw that in the election cycle with a lot of Latinos supporting the removal of illegal immigrants into the United States. As a Democrat, Luis, don't you think that the position of the Democratic Party should modify itself to sort of meet the attitudes of Americans as it relates to immigration? Because I think a lot of what you're saying is right on as far as the inability of the U.S. Congress to come up with laws and regulations to have an effective and orderly immigration system. But public attitudes are also changing, and you're seeing that because they're tolerating what Donald Trump is doing, and there is an outrage by a critical mass of Americans. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think there are people who are rejecting, and you do see the numbers for Trump lowering in terms of people just feeling uncomfortable with this violation of due process. And what they are now realizing is not what they were sold. They were told that he was going to go after criminals and that the criminals had come in during the Biden administration. The reality is people who were here on some sort of immigration status who had a criminal record, 90% of them came in long before Joe Biden ever became president, including during the Trump administration. So that's one. And so people were thinking that this was going to be removals of people with criminal records. What they're seeing now again is moms being taken away from their 2-year-olds, people being picked up in the back of a church, people being having their windows smashed in while they're live streaming as they try to speak with their lawyers. And these are people who do not have a criminal record. And so that, I think, is changing attitudes. But Democrats absolutely need to change their mindset on immigration and start recognizing that if you're worried about the security of somebody who's on the other side of the border in Mexico, then you should acknowledge that we need a robust form of security along the border to keep those threats out. Because there are cartels who do deal in fentanyl and human trafficking and plenty of other violence that we don't want coming in, and we should want to go after those. So we should want to go after MS-13. We should want to go after TDA, and Democrats should be able to say that. I think the problem with Democrats right now is that they're scared of the issue because they lost on it, and they don't know how to talk about it, and they're going to have to flip that so that they can both present a robust. Ruben Gallego in Arizona is starting to do that. He just introduced a bill. You have to be able to advocate on behalf of border security, but also for an immigration system that meets the economic needs that we have, the labor needs, and then maintains some space also for people who legitimately need refuge. Before we close out today, we also want to take a moment to send our condolences to the families and friends of those murdered outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. We've spoken a lot about the need to defend and stand up for a liberal democracy, one in which we allow for a difference of opinions and where we find compromise while respecting the civil liberties of everyone in America. Those concepts are fundamental for our democracy to survive. Political violence cannot be tolerated, nor can we remain silent in the face of growing anti-Semitism. The same is, of course, true of Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment. Just this month, a man in Illinois was convicted for the hate crime murder of a 6-year-old Muslim boy in an attack that also left the boy's mother severely injured. That too was unacceptable. We must find constructive ways to debate, to find common ground, and when we seek to apply political pressure, to do so in a way that respects the rights of groups we do not belong to. This is where our civic institutions, from schools to the press, and spaces for public dialogue play a vital role, fostering understanding, not division. And civil society must not remain on the sidelines. Faith communities, NGOs, educators, and local leaders all have a responsibility to help ensure that no one should fear to worship or not worship, to attend a museum, or to walk through their college campus because of who they are. We must stand together against all forms of hate and extremism. As Dr. Martin Luther King so simply and clearly put it, hate begets hate, force begets force, violence begets violence. We can do better. As you all head out for the long weekend to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice, we wish you a meaningful Memorial Day. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.